Welcome to one of the most chilling tales from the frontier, where loneliness became a weapon and companionship led to death. Before we dive into this nightmare, tell me in the comments, are you watching this alone right now? And what time is it where you are? I'm curious how many of you are brave enough to hear this story in the dead of night. In the scorching summer of 1878, in a remote valley outside of Tombstone, Arizona, there lived a woman who became known as the most dangerous predator in the entire territory. Her name was Isabel Crane, and she had a simple request that no man could resist. She just wanted company. But every single man who walked through her front door vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions that would haunt the Arizona territory for decades. This is the true story of how one woman's grief turned into an insatiable hunger for death, and how she perfected the art of making men disappear so completely that even their bones were never found. What you're about to hear will make you think twice about ever trusting a lonely stranger again. The year 1878 was a time of boom and bust in Arizona territory. Silver had been discovered in the hills around Tombstone, drawing thousands of prospectors, gamblers, and desperate men looking for their fortune. The territory was wild and lawless, where a man could disappear for 100 different reasons, and nobody would ask too many questions. That's exactly the environment Isabel Crane needed for her deadly work. She had chosen her location perfectly, a small ranch house nestled in Devil's Canyon, about 15 miles from the main road to Tombstone, far enough from civilization that screams wouldn't carry, but close enough to the silver trails that desperate men would pass by her door regularly. The house itself looked innocent enough from the outside, a modest wooden structure with a wraparound porch, flower boxes in the windows, and a well-tended garden that suggested a woman who took pride in her home. But looks can be deceiving, and in Isabel's case, that innocent appearance was the most dangerous trap in all of Arizona. Local records show that Isabel had arrived in the territory in early 1877, claiming to be a recent widow from back east who wanted to start fresh in the Arizona wilderness. She paid cash for her property and seemed to have enough money to live comfortably without needing to work. Nobody questioned her story too closely. The frontier was full of people running from their past, and most folks minded their own business. Dr. Marcus Webb, one of the few educated men in the region, had the misfortune of meeting Isabel at a church social in Tombstone just a few months after she arrived. His account, written in letters to his brother back in Philadelphia, gives us our first glimpse of the woman who would become Arizona's most feared killer. Mrs. Crane is a handsome woman of perhaps 30 years, with auburn hair and the most striking green eyes I have ever seen, Dr. Webb wrote. She carries herself with the dignity of a lady, speaking in cultured tones that suggest education and refinement. Yet there is something unsettling about her gaze. It seems to linger too long on a man's face, as if she were studying him for purposes I cannot fathom. The doctor's observations proved more accurate than he could have imagined. During our conversation, she questioned me extensively about my living arrangements, my family connections, and whether I had anyone who would miss me if I were to disappear suddenly. At the time, I attributed these inquiries to the natural caution of a woman living alone on the frontier, but in retrospect, they seem more sinister. Dr. Webb's letter continues with details that would later prove crucial to understanding Isabel's methods. She mentioned several times how lonely she had become in her isolated home, and how much she would appreciate the company of a gentleman caller. Her invitations seemed innocent enough, but something in her manner made me politely decline. I cannot explain the instinct that warned me away from her hospitality. The doctor's intuition saved his life, though he wouldn't realize it for months. Other men were not so fortunate, and they began disappearing with alarming frequency throughout the summer and fall of 1878. The pattern was always the same. A traveling man would be seen talking to Isabel in town. She would invite him to visit her home for dinner or to help with some task around her property, and he would never be seen again. The first confirmed victim was James Patterson, a prospector who had struck it rich in a small claim north of Tombstone. He was last seen leaving Murphy's saloon with Isabel on a Saturday evening in June, telling the bartender he was going to help the widow lady with some repairs to her roof. His horse was found wandering loose 3 days later, but James himself had vanished completely. When concerned friends rode out to Isabel's ranch to inquire about Patterson's whereabouts, she told them a believable story about how he had helped with the repairs, enjoyed a home-cooked meal, and left the next morning to continue his journey south. She even produced a note, allegedly written by Patterson, thanking her for her hospitality, and explaining that he had decided to try his luck in the silver mines near Tucson. The handwriting looked authentic enough, and Isabel's story seemed perfectly reasonable. After all, prospectors were notorious for changing their plans on a whim, chasing rumors of new strikes wherever they might lead. Nobody suspected that they were looking at Arizona's first female serial killer, a woman who had perfected the art of forgery and deception. But Patterson's disappearance was just the beginning. Over the next 6 months, at least 8 more men vanished after being seen in Isabel's company. Each time she had a perfectly reasonable explanation for their absence, complete with forged notes and believable stories about sudden changes in travel plans. The victims came from all walks of life, but they shared certain characteristics that Isabel found attractive. They were typically traveling alone, had no close family ties in the territory, and possessed some form of wealth, either cash, gold dust, or valuable equipment. Most importantly, they were all men who wouldn't be missed immediately if they disappeared. Thomas Mitchell, a cattle buyer from Colorado, became victim number 3 in July. He had been in Tombstone negotiating the purchase of a herd when he met Isabel at the general store. Witnesses saw them talking for nearly an hour, with Isabel playing the part of the charming but lonely widow to perfection. She had a way of making a man feel like he was the most interesting person in the world, recalled store owner Henry Murphy. Listened to every word Tom said about his business, asked all the right questions, and seemed genuinely impressed by his success. By the end of their conversation, he was practically begging for the chance to call on her. Mitchell left town that afternoon with plans to visit Isabel's ranch for Sunday dinner. His business associates expected him back in Tombstone by Tuesday to finalize the cattle deal, but Tuesday came and went with no sign of the Colorado man. When they finally rode out to investigate, Isabel produced another perfectly forged note explaining that Mitchell had received urgent word about family troubles back home and had departed immediately for Colorado. The pattern continued throughout the summer and into the fall. Samuel Brooks, a traveling salesman, disappeared in August. Robert Hayes, a mining engineer, vanished in September. Each time, Isabel had a story, a forged note, and an innocent explanation for why the man had left her ranch alone and in good health. But the truth about what was happening to these men was far more sinister than anyone imagined. The few clues that survived Isabel's careful planning paint a picture of systematic murder carried out with chilling efficiency and twisted creativity. The first hint of the real horror came from an unexpected source. A Mexican ranch hand named Carlos Valdez, who worked for a neighboring spread about 5 miles from Isabel's place. Carlos had developed the habit of watching Isabel's property through a spyglass, partly out of curiosity about the mysterious widow, and partly because he had romantic interests of his own. What Carlos saw during his nighttime surveillance sessions would haunt him for the rest of his life. His account, given to territorial authorities months later, provides our only eyewitness testimony about Isabel's methods and the fate of her victims. "I saw strange lights moving around her property late at night," Carlos told investigators through an interpreter. "Not normal lantern light from inside the house, but fires burning out in the desert behind her place. Sometimes I could see figures moving around these fires, but it was too far away to make out details." Carlos's testimony became more disturbing as he described what he observed over several months of watching. 3 or 4 times I saw her dragging something heavy from the house toward those fire sites. Something wrapped in blankets that was about the size and shape of a man's body. She was stronger than she looked, that woman. Could handle a dead weight by herself without much trouble. The ranch hand's account revealed the methodical nature of Isabel's disposal methods. The fires would burn for hours, sometimes all night long. In the morning, there would be nothing left but ashes that she would scatter to the wind. I never saw her bury anything or leave any trace of what she had burned. Carlos had witnessed something far more sinister than simple murder. He had observed a systematic disposal operation that left virtually no physical evidence of the crimes. Isabel had not only perfected the art of killing, she had also solved the problem of making bodies disappear completely. The Mexican's testimony also revealed details about Isabel's methods for luring victims to their deaths. She would invite men to dinner, always on nights when there was no moon and the darkness was complete. I could see lights in her house during these dinner parties, but by morning, there was always only one horse in her stable, her own. Carlos described observing what appeared to be elaborate dinner preparations before each victim's arrival. She would spend all day cooking, cleaning, and preparing the house as if she were expecting a marriage proposal instead of planning a murder. Everything had to be perfect for her guest's final meal. The ranch hand's surveillance also revealed Isabel's careful attention to timing and logistics. She never invited two men on consecutive nights, and she always waited at least a week between victims. She was patient, methodical, like a spider that never rushed when prey was caught in her web. But Carlos's most chilling observation concerned what happened to the victim's belongings and horses. The next day, after each dinner party, she would load saddlebags and equipment onto a pack mule and disappear for several hours. When she came back, the mule was empty, and another man's possessions had vanished forever. Sure, the territorial investigation that eventually followed would reveal that Isabel had established a network of hiding places throughout the desert where she could dispose of evidence without risk of discovery. She had spent months exploring every canyon, cave, and abandoned mine shaft within a 50-mile radius of her ranch, creating the perfect system for making all traces of her victims disappear. The beginning of the end for Isabel's killing spree came in November 1878, when she made the mistake of targeting a man who had friends willing to ask uncomfortable questions. William Crawford was a successful merchant from Phoenix who had traveled to Tombstone to investigate business opportunities in the booming silver trade. Crawford was exactly the type of victim Isabel preferred: wealthy, traveling alone, and with no immediate family expecting his return. But unlike her previous victims, Crawford had business partners who became concerned when he failed to return as scheduled and began their own investigation into his disappearance. The merchant's partners hired private detective Frank Morrison, a former Pinkerton agent who had settled in Arizona after being wounded during a railroad investigation. Morrison's professional training and systematic approach to investigation would prove to be exactly what was needed to uncover Isabel's deadly secret. Morrison began his investigation by retracing Crawford's steps during his final days in Tombstone. Multiple witnesses confirmed that Crawford had been seen talking to an attractive widow woman outside the bank on the day before his disappearance. The description matched Isabel perfectly, and Morrison decided to pay her a visit. The detective's account of his encounter with Isabel reveals the calculating intelligence behind her innocent facade. Mrs. Crane received me with perfect courtesy and expressed appropriate concern about Mr. Crawford's disappearance. She acknowledged meeting him in town but claimed their conversation had been brief and purely social in nature. Morrison's professional training made him suspicious of responses that seemed too perfect. Her story was flawless in every detail, but that perfection itself was suspicious. In my experience, innocent people's accounts are usually inconsistent in minor ways because memory is imperfect. Mrs. Crane's version of events was too polished, too rehearsed. The detective decided to investigate further by questioning other residents about the pattern of disappearances in the area. What he discovered shocked even a man who had spent years dealing with the worst of human nature. Over the course of 2 days, I documented at least 9 cases of men who had vanished after being seen in Mrs. Crane's company. The statistical probability of such coincidences was essentially zero. Morrison's investigation also revealed the sophisticated nature of Isabel's deception methods. Each disappearance had been explained by a handwritten note allegedly from the missing man, explaining his sudden change of plans. When I compared these notes, I found subtle similarities in handwriting that suggested they had all been written by the same person, someone with considerable skill at forgery. The detective's breakthrough came when he decided to stake out Isabel's ranch to observe her activities firsthand. Working with Carlos Valdez, who had been watching the property for months, Morrison positioned himself where he could monitor the house without being detected. What Morrison witnessed during his surveillance confirmed the Mexican ranch hand's earlier testimony and provided the evidence needed to expose Isabel's crimes. On the night of November 15th, I observed Mrs. Crane entertaining a gentleman caller at her residence. The man arrived on horseback just after sunset, and I could see him through the windows enjoying what appeared to be an elaborate dinner. Morrison's professional training had prepared him for many things, but witnessing premeditated murder was still a shock. At approximately 10 o'clock, I saw Mrs. Crane serve what appeared to be coffee or tea to her guest. Within minutes, the man slumped forward in his chair, clearly unconscious or dead. Mrs. Crane showed no distress at this development, instead beginning methodical preparations that suggested she had done this many times before. The detective watched in horror as Isabel systematically disposed of her latest victim. She stripped the body of all clothing and personal effects, wrapped it in canvas, and dragged it outside to a previously prepared fire pit. The efficiency of her movements suggested long practice with this grisly routine. Morrison's testimony would later provide crucial evidence in the case against Isabel. I observed her maintaining the fire throughout the night, periodically adding fuel and tending the flames until nothing remained but ashes. By morning, there was no trace of the man who had entered her house the previous evening. The detective's surveillance also revealed the disposal method for victims' belongings and horses. The following day, Mrs. Crane loaded the deceased man's possessions onto a pack animal and departed toward the desert. She returned several hours later with the animal unloaded, having disposed of the evidence in some remote location. Armed with eyewitness testimony and physical evidence, Morrison contacted territorial authorities and requested immediate action against Isabel Crane. But capturing a suspect who had perfected the art of making evidence disappear would prove more challenging than expected. When Sheriff Coleman and his deputies arrived at Isabel's ranch with an arrest warrant, they found a woman who seemed genuinely puzzled by the accusations against her. She denied any knowledge of missing men, claiming that any visitors to her ranch had departed in good health and according to their own plans. Mrs. Crane's performance during questioning was masterful, Sheriff Coleman later reported. She displayed exactly the right mixture of confusion, indignation, and feminine distress that would be expected from an innocent woman falsely accused of terrible crimes. If not for Detective Morrison's eyewitness testimony, I might have been inclined to believe her protests of innocence. The search of Isabel's property revealed few obvious signs of criminal activity. The house was immaculate, with no bloodstains or evidence of violence. The fire pit Morrison had observed was cold and showed no signs of recent use. Even the most thorough search failed to turn up physical evidence that would definitively prove murder had occurred. But Isabel had made one crucial mistake that would ultimately lead to her conviction. Hidden in a secret compartment beneath her bedroom floor, investigators discovered a collection of personal items that had belonged to her victims: watches, jewelry, important papers, and most damning of all, detailed notes about each man's background and financial situation. Dr. Webb, who had narrowly escaped becoming one of Isabel's victims, was called upon to examine the evidence and provide medical testimony about the likely methods used to kill the victims. His analysis revealed the sophisticated nature of Isabel's murder techniques. Based on witness testimony and the physical evidence recovered, it appears Mrs. Crane employed poison as her primary method of execution, Dr. Webb testified. The rapid onset of unconsciousness observed by Detective Morrison suggests the use of chloral hydrate or a similar substance that could be easily disguised in food or drink. The physician's testimony revealed how Isabel had acquired the knowledge and materials necessary for systematic poisoning. Analysis of items found in her possession indicates familiarity with various toxic substances and their effects on the human body. Such knowledge suggests either medical training or extensive study of pharmacological texts. Dr. Webb's examination also explained how Isabel had been able to dispose of bodies so completely that no physical remains were ever discovered. The extended burning process witnessed by Mr. Morrison, combined with the desert climate and scavenging animals, would be sufficient to eliminate virtually all traces of human remains. Mrs. Crane had discovered methods that were nearly perfect for concealing evidence of her crimes. The trial of Isabel Crane became one of the most sensational criminal cases in Arizona Territory history. The courtroom was packed daily with spectators eager to catch a glimpse of the woman who had terrorized the frontier with her deadly hospitality. Isabel's defense attorney argued that the evidence against her was purely circumstantial, and that his client was the victim of malicious gossip spread by superstitious frontier residents. He claimed that the missing men had simply chosen to leave the area for reasons of their own, and that Isabel was being scapegoated because of her status as an unmarried woman living alone. But the prosecution's case was overwhelming. Detective Morrison's eyewitness testimony, Carlos Valdez's months of surveillance observations, and the physical evidence found in Isabel's secret compartment created a picture of systematic murder that the defense could not explain away. The most damning evidence came from handwriting analysis of the forged notes that had been used to explain each victim's disappearance. Expert testimony established that all the notes had been written by the same person, and comparison samples proved that Isabel was that person. During the trial, additional witnesses came forward with testimony about Isabel's behavior and methods. Several Tombstone residents recalled conversations in which she had questioned them extensively about their personal circumstances and travel plans. Others remembered seeing her studying men in saloons and stores with an intensity that had made them uncomfortable. The prosecution also revealed that Isabel's background story was entirely fabricated. No record could be found of her supposed deceased husband, her claimed origins in the East, or any of the family connections she had described. She had created a complete false identity to support her predatory activities. When called to testify in her own defense, Isabel maintained her innocence with the same calm demeanor she had displayed throughout her killing spree. She denied all accusations against her and claimed that any evidence found in her possession had been planted by enemies seeking to destroy her reputation. But the jury saw through her performance, recognizing the calculating intelligence behind her facade of feminine helplessness. After deliberating for less than 2 hours, they returned a verdict of guilty on all counts of first-degree murder. Judge William Henderson, who presided over the trial, noted the unprecedented nature of the case in his sentencing remarks. "In 30 years of frontier jurisprudence, I have never encountered a criminal who combined such methodical planning with such complete disregard for human life. Mrs. Crane's crimes represent a level of systematic evil that challenges our understanding of human nature." The judge's sentence reflected both the severity of Isabel's crimes and the need to send a clear message about territorial justice. The defendant will be executed by hanging at sunrise on January 15, 1880, and may God have mercy on her soul, for this court cannot. Isabel Crane was executed as scheduled, becoming one of the few women to face capital punishment in Arizona territory. She maintained her innocence to the end, refusing to provide any information about the fate of her victims or the methods she had used to dispose of their remains. The execution drew hundreds of spectators from throughout the territory, many of whom had traveled considerable distances to witness the end of Arizona's most feared serial killer. Local newspapers provided extensive coverage of the event, with headlines that reflected the public fascination with Isabel's crimes. But even Isabel's death did not end the mysteries surrounding her deadly career. Despite extensive searches of the desert areas around her ranch, investigators never recovered any physical remains of her victims. The locations where she had hidden their belongings and equipment were never discovered, leaving dozens of questions unanswered. Modern forensic techniques have enabled contemporary investigators to examine the case with tools that were unavailable to territorial authorities. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of Isabel's former property have revealed several anomalous areas that might contain buried evidence, but excavation has been limited by the remote location and harsh desert conditions. Psychological profiles developed by modern criminal experts suggest that Isabel suffered from a combination of psychopathic personality disorder and severe antisocial behavior patterns that enabled her to commit systematic murder without emotional distress. Her ability to maintain a facade of normalcy while conducting regular killings demonstrates the sophisticated psychological camouflage techniques used by successful serial killers. The case has also attracted attention from researchers studying the historical development of criminal investigation techniques. Detective Morrison's systematic approach to gathering evidence and establishing victim patterns represents an early example of modern investigative methods applied to serial murder cases. For the residents of Arizona Territory, Isabel's crimes had a lasting impact on social attitudes toward strangers and isolated living arrangements. The idea that a seemingly respectable woman could be responsible for systematic murder challenged traditional assumptions about gender roles and criminal behavior. Local folklore has preserved numerous stories about Isabel's crimes, often embellished with supernatural elements that reflect the profound impact her case had on frontier communities. These folk tales typically emphasize moral lessons about the dangers of trusting appearances and the importance of community vigilance. The site of Isabel's former ranch remains largely unchanged, though the original buildings have long since been destroyed by weather and time. Occasional visitors report feeling uneasy when exploring the area, though these sensations are more likely attributable to knowledge of the location's history than to any supernatural influences. Archaeological interest in the site continues, with researchers hoping that improved technology might eventually reveal the locations where Isabel disposed of evidence from her crimes. The harsh desert environment has preserved many historical sites remarkably well, raising the possibility that future investigations might uncover additional evidence about her methods and victims. For modern true crime enthusiasts, the case of Isabel Crane represents one of the most sophisticated serial murder operations of the 19th century. Her combination of systematic victim selection, efficient disposal methods, and elaborate deception techniques created a nearly perfect system for conducting multiple murders while avoiding detection. The psychological aspects of the case continue to fascinate researchers studying the motivations and methods of female serial killers. Isabel's use of traditional gender expectations as camouflage for predatory behavior represents a pattern that has been observed in numerous contemporary cases. Educational programs developed by frontier historical societies often include the Isabel Crane case as an example of how criminal behavior adapted to the unique conditions of territorial life. Her exploitation of frontier hospitality customs and the vulnerability of traveling men demonstrates how social traditions can be weaponized by predators. Contemporary law enforcement agencies study Isabel's case as an historical example of how serial killers exploit social vulnerabilities and institutional limitations to avoid detection while conducting systematic crimes. Her methods for victim selection and evidence disposal continue to inform modern understanding of criminal behavior patterns. For those who travel the lonely roads of the American Southwest, the story of Isabel Crane serves as a reminder that the greatest dangers on the frontier often came from sources that appeared most harmless. Her ability to use loneliness and hospitality as weapons demonstrates how predators can exploit our most basic human needs for companionship and social connection. Welcome to one of the most chilling tales from the frontier, where loneliness became a weapon and companionship led to death. Before we dive into this nightmare, tell me in the comments, are you watching this alone right now? And what time is it where you are? I'm curious how many of you are brave enough to hear this story in the dead of night. In the scorching summer of 1878, in a remote valley outside of Tombstone, Arizona, there lived a woman who became known as the most dangerous predator in the entire territory. Her name was Isabel Crane, and she had a simple request that no man could resist. She just wanted company. But every single man who walked through her front door vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions that would haunt the Arizona territory for decades. This is the true story of how one woman's grief turned into an insatiable hunger for death, and how she perfected the art of making men disappear so completely that even their bones were never found. What you're about to hear will make you think twice about ever trusting a lonely stranger again. The year 1878 was a time of boom and bust in Arizona territory. The great silver strikes around Tombstone had drawn thousands of men from across the country, all hoping to strike it rich in the desert mountains. But for every man who found fortune, dozens more found only disappointment, debt, and desperation. These were the perfect hunting grounds for someone like Isabel Crane. The territory was filled with transient men, prospectors, gamblers, drifters, and fortune seekers who moved from camp to camp with no permanent ties and no one to miss them if they disappeared. It was an environment where a clever predator could operate for years without being detected. The Arizona Territory in 1878 was still very much the Wild West. Law enforcement was sparse and often corrupt. Communication between settlements was slow and unreliable. A man could vanish between one town and the next, and it might be weeks or months before anyone noticed he was missing. This was exactly the kind of environment that Isabel needed for her deadly work. She had chosen her location with the calculating precision of a military strategist. Devil's Canyon was a narrow valley about 15 miles southeast of Tombstone, accessible only by a single winding trail that made it impossible for anyone to approach or leave without being seen from her house. The nearest neighbor was over 8 miles away, far enough that sounds wouldn't carry even on the stillest desert night. The house itself had been built by a prospector named Jacob Morrison, who had struck a small but profitable silver vein in the canyon walls. Morrison had constructed a solid 2-story wooden house with a stone foundation, built to withstand both the harsh desert climate and potential Indian attacks. But Morrison's luck had run out in the winter of 1876 when Apache raiders killed him and burned his mine works. The house had sat empty for nearly a year before Isabel arrived with her cash payment and her carefully crafted story about being a grieving widow seeking solitude. Local records from the Cochise County Courthouse show that Isabel paid $800 in gold coin for the Morrison property, a substantial sum that raised eyebrows among the few residents who bothered to keep track of such things. Where a recently widowed woman from back east had acquired that kind of money was a question nobody thought to ask at the time, though it would later prove crucial to understanding her true background. The transformation Isabel made to the property was subtle but significant. She added flower boxes to the windows, planted a vegetable garden, and made repairs that gave the house a welcoming, domestic appearance that contrasted sharply with the harsh, desert landscape. She also made less visible modifications, reinforcing the cellar door, installing heavy curtains that could block light from the windows, and constructing what appeared to be a large outdoor oven behind the house. Dr. Marcus Webb, one of the few college-educated men in the region, had the unfortunate experience of meeting Isabel at a church social in Tombstone during her first month in the territory. His detailed account of their encounter, preserved in letters to his brother in Philadelphia, provides our first glimpse into the calculating mind behind Isabel's innocent facade. I was introduced to Mrs. Crane by Reverend Matthews, who mentioned that she was a recent arrival seeking to establish herself in our community, Dr. Webb wrote. She is an uncommonly attractive woman, perhaps 30 years of age, with auburn hair arranged in the latest Eastern fashion and green eyes that seem to capture and hold a man's attention with unusual intensity. The doctor's medical training made him observant of details that others might overlook. During our conversation, I noted that Mrs. Crane's hands, while soft and well cared for, bore calluses and small scars that suggested familiarity with heavy manual labor, unusual for a woman of the refinement she claimed to possess. When I commented on this observation, she quickly changed the subject. Dr. Webb's letter reveals his growing unease during their conversation. Mrs. Crane questioned me extensively about my background, my living arrangements, and my professional obligations. While such inquiries might seem natural for someone new to the community, there was an intensity to her interest that made me uncomfortable. She seemed particularly interested in whether I had family connections in the territory and how often I traveled to other settlements. The physician's account becomes more disturbing as he describes Isabel's behavior throughout the evening. I observed Mrs. Crane engaging in similar intense conversations with other gentlemen present, always asking the same types of questions about their personal circumstances and travel habits. She displayed an almost predatory focus on men who appeared to be traveling alone, or who mentioned having no close family ties in the area. Dr. Webb's medical expertise allowed him to notice subtle physical signs that suggested Isabel was not what she appeared to be. Despite her claims of recent widowhood and the grief that would naturally accompany such loss, Mrs. Crane displayed none of the physical or emotional symptoms I would expect to see in someone experiencing genuine bereavement. Her appetite was hearty, her sleep appeared untroubled, and her demeanor suggested anticipation rather than mourning. The doctor's letter concludes with observations that would prove prophetic. Before departing the social, Mrs. Crane extended an invitation for me to call upon her at her ranch, mentioning how much she would appreciate the company of an educated gentleman in her isolated circumstances. While her invitation seemed innocent enough, something in her manner, a calculating quality behind her smile, made me politely decline. I cannot explain the instinct that warned me away from her hospitality, but I am grateful I trusted it. Dr. Webb's intuition would later save his life, though he wouldn't realize the danger he had escaped until months later when the pattern of disappearances became impossible to ignore. Other men were not so fortunate in their encounters with Isabel's deadly charm. The first confirmed victim was James Patterson, a 42-year-old prospector from Colorado who had struck a modest but profitable gold claim in the hills north of Tombstone. Patterson was exactly the type of man Isabel found most attractive as prey, traveling alone, carrying significant wealth, and with no close family ties in the territory, who would immediately notice his absence. Patterson's final day alive began like any other. He had ridden into Tombstone on a Saturday morning to sell a small quantity of gold dust and purchase supplies for another week of mining. Several witnesses later recalled seeing him at Murphy's General Store, where he made purchases that suggested he was planning to return to his claim within a day or two. It was outside Murphy's store that Patterson first encountered Isabel Crane. Store owner Henry Murphy later testified that he observed the two engaged in conversation for nearly 30 minutes, with Isabel playing the role of the charming but lonely widow to perfection. Mrs. Crane had a gift for making every man feel like he was the most interesting person she'd ever met, Murphy recalled. She listened to every word Patterson said about his mining operation, asked intelligent questions about his techniques, and seemed genuinely impressed by his success. By the end of their conversation, Patterson was practically glowing with pride. Murphy's testimony revealed how skillfully Isabel manipulated her victim's emotions and desires. She mentioned several times how isolated she felt living alone in Devil's Canyon, and how much she missed the company of an intelligent gentleman who could appreciate good conversation and a home-cooked meal. Patterson, like most of the men in this territory, hadn't had a proper meal or decent company in months. The store owner watched as Isabel extended her invitation with perfect timing and presentation. She didn't seem desperate or forward, just genuinely lonely and hopeful that a kind gentleman might take pity on a widow's solitude. Patterson jumped at the chance to spend Sunday afternoon with such a refined lady, especially one who promised to prepare a feast fit for a king. Patterson left Tombstone that Saturday afternoon with plans to visit Isabel's ranch the following day. He told several people about his dinner invitation, joking that he might have found himself a wife, as well as a fortune in the Arizona desert. Those would be the last words anyone heard James Patterson speak. When Patterson failed to return to his mining claim by Tuesday, other prospectors in the area began to worry. Patterson was known as a reliable man who kept to his schedules and would have sent word if his plans had changed. A search party of 4 men rode out to investigate, starting with Isabel's ranch since that had been Patterson's last known destination. Isabel's performance when the searchers arrived was masterful in its calculated innocence. She expressed appropriate concern about Patterson's absence and provided a perfectly believable account of his visit to her ranch. Mr. Patterson arrived Sunday afternoon as planned and proved to be delightful company, she told the searchers. We enjoyed a lengthy dinner and pleasant conversation about his mining experiences. He seemed quite taken with some stories I had heard about promising silver deposits near Tucson, and mentioned that he might investigate those opportunities before returning to his current claim. Isabel produced a handwritten note that she claimed Patterson had left for her, thanking her for her hospitality, and explaining that he had decided to investigate the Tucson silver prospects immediately rather than returning to his claim. The handwriting appeared authentic, and her story seemed perfectly reasonable to men who knew how quickly a prospector's plans could change based on rumors of new strikes. What the searchers didn't know was that they were looking at Arizona Territory's first documented serial killer, a woman who had spent months perfecting the art of forgery and developing foolproof methods for disposing of evidence. The note they examined was a perfect imitation of Patterson's handwriting, created by someone with considerable skill and practice in document forgery. Patterson's disappearance established the pattern that Isabel would follow for the next 6 months. She would identify suitable victims during trips to Tombstone, engage them in carefully calculated conversations that revealed their vulnerabilities and circumstances, and then extend invitations that seemed like generous hospitality but were actually death sentences. The second confirmed victim was Thomas Mitchell, a cattle buyer from Colorado who had traveled to Arizona to purchase livestock for his ranch back home. Mitchell possessed all the characteristics Isabel looked for in her prey. He was traveling alone, carried substantial cash for his cattle purchases, and had no family or business associates in the territory who would immediately miss him if he disappeared. Mitchell's encounter with Isabel occurred at the First National Bank of Tombstone, where both had business on a Tuesday morning in July. Bank President Edward Hayes later testified that he observed their conversation and was struck by how quickly Mitchell seemed to fall under Isabel's spell. Mrs. Crane approached Mr. Mitchell while he was waiting for his transaction to be completed, Hayes recalled. Within minutes, she had learned about his cattle buying business, his success in Colorado, and his plans for expanding his ranch. Mitchell seemed flattered by her interest and began boasting about his achievements in ways that revealed exactly how much money he was carrying. The bank president's testimony revealed Isabel's sophisticated approach to victim selection. She didn't seem to be flirting exactly, but there was something about her attention that made Mitchell puff up with pride. She asked all the right questions to make him feel important and successful, while gathering information about his travel plans and business obligations. Hayes watched as Isabel extended her invitation with the same calculated charm she had used on Patterson. By the time they parted company, Mitchell had agreed to visit her ranch for Sunday dinner. He told me afterward that he was looking forward to spending time with such an intelligent and refined lady, especially one who appreciated his business acumen. Mitchell's fate followed the exact same pattern as Patterson's. He left Tombstone on Sunday morning with plans to spend the day at Isabel's ranch and return to town by evening to finalize his cattle purchases. When he failed to appear at his scheduled Monday morning appointments, his business associates began searching for him. Once again, Isabel had a perfect explanation and another forged note. This time, Mitchell had supposedly received urgent word about family troubles back in Colorado and had departed immediately, promising to return to complete his business dealings once his family crisis was resolved. The story was believable, the note appeared authentic, and nobody suspected that they were dealing with systematic murder. But the pattern of disappearances was beginning to attract attention from people who understood that coincidences of this magnitude were statistically impossible. Carlos Valdez, a Mexican ranch hand who worked for a neighboring spread, had been watching Isabel's property with growing suspicion and alarm. Carlos's observations, later provided to territorial authorities through an interpreter, give us our only eyewitness account of what actually happened to Isabel's victims. His testimony paints a picture of systematic murder carried out with chilling efficiency and careful planning. I began watching the Señora's house because I was curious about the mysterious widow woman who lived alone in such an isolated place, Carlos testified. At first I watched because I thought she might welcome the courtship of a hard-working man, but what I saw made me understand that she was something much more dangerous than a lonely woman. Carlos's surveillance revealed the methodical nature of Isabel's operation. She never invited men on consecutive nights, and she always waited at least a week between dinner guests. I noticed that she would spend days preparing for these visits, cleaning the house thoroughly, preparing special foods, and arranging everything as if she were expecting a marriage proposal rather than planning murder. The ranch hand's testimony revealed disturbing details about what happened during these dinner parties. I would position myself on the ridge overlooking her property and watch through a spyglass I had borrowed from my employer. I could see lights in the house during dinner, and sometimes I could make out figures moving around the main room. But by morning, there was always only one horse in the stable, the Señora's mare. Carlos described observing Isabel's disposal methods with horrifying clarity. In the early hours before dawn, I would see her dragging something heavy from the house toward the large outdoor oven she had built behind her property. The bundles she dragged were always wrapped in canvas and were about the size and shape of a man's body. The ranch hand's account revealed the systematic way Isabel eliminated all physical evidence of her crimes. She would maintain fires in that oven for hours, sometimes all through the night and into the next day. The flames would burn very hot, and by the time they died down, there was nothing left but fine ash that she would scatter to the desert winds. Carlos's surveillance also revealed how Isabel disposed of her victims' belongings and horses. The day after each dinner party, she would load saddlebags and equipment onto a pack mule and disappear into the desert for several hours. When she returned, the mule was empty, and another man's possessions had vanished forever. The Mexican's testimony provided crucial insights into Isabel's careful planning and systematic approach to murder. She had spent months exploring every canyon, cave, and abandoned mine shaft within 50 miles of her ranch. She knew hiding places where she could dispose of evidence without any risk of discovery, even years later. Carlos's growing alarm about what he was witnessing led him to confide in his employer, ranch owner Samuel Morrison. Morrison initially dismissed the Mexican's concerns as superstition and imagination, but as more men disappeared after visiting Isabel's ranch, he began to take the reports more seriously. The beginning of the end for Isabel's killing spree came when she made the crucial mistake of targeting William Crawford, a successful Phoenix merchant who had traveled to Tombstone to investigate business opportunities in the booming silver trade. Crawford possessed all the characteristics Isabel preferred in her victims. He was wealthy, traveling alone, and had no immediate family expecting his return. But unlike her previous victims, Crawford had business partners who refused to accept convenient explanations for his disappearance. Crawford's partners, concerned by his failure to return as scheduled, hired private detective Frank Morrison to investigate. Morrison was a former Pinkerton agent who had settled in Arizona after being wounded during a railroad investigation. His professional training and systematic approach would prove to be exactly what was needed to expose Isabel's deadly secret. Morrison began his investigation by meticulously retracing Crawford's activities during his final days in Tombstone. Multiple witnesses confirmed that Crawford had been seen talking to an attractive widow woman outside the bank on the day before his disappearance. The detailed descriptions provided by these witnesses matched Isabel Crane perfectly. The detective's first interview with Isabel revealed the calculating intelligence behind her innocent facade. "Mrs. Crane received me with perfect courtesy and expressed appropriate concern about Mr. Crawford's disappearance," Morrison later reported. "She acknowledged meeting him briefly in town, but claimed their conversation had been purely social and of no particular significance." Morrison's professional experience made him suspicious of responses that seemed too polished and rehearsed. Her account of meeting Crawford was flawless in every detail, too flawless for someone recalling a casual encounter from several days earlier. "In my experience investigating crimes, innocent people's memories are usually inconsistent in minor ways because human memory is naturally imperfect." The detective decided to investigate further by systematically documenting all reported disappearances in the area over the previous months. What he discovered shocked even a man who had spent years dealing with the worst of human behavior. "Over the course of 3 days, I identified and documented at least 9 cases of men who had vanished without explanation after being seen in Mrs. Crane's company," Morrison reported. The statistical probability of such a pattern occurring by coincidence was essentially zero. "I was looking at evidence of systematic predatory behavior." Morrison's investigation revealed the sophisticated methods Isabel had developed for covering her tracks. Each disappearance had been explained by a handwritten note, allegedly from the missing man, detailing sudden changes in travel plans or family emergencies that required immediate departure. When I obtained samples of these notes for comparison, I found subtle but consistent similarities in handwriting style that suggested they had all been created by the same person. The detective's breakthrough came when he decided to conduct surveillance of Isabel's ranch in cooperation with Carlos Valdez, who had been watching the property for months. Working together, they positioned themselves where they could monitor the house without being detected by someone who had proven herself to be extremely cautious and observant. What Morrison witnessed during his surveillance confirmed Carlos's earlier testimony and provided the legal evidence needed to expose Isabel's crimes. "On the night of November 15th, I observed Mrs. Crane entertaining a gentleman caller, a traveling salesman named Robert Hayes, who had been seen talking to her in Tombstone 2 days earlier." Morrison's detailed account of that night's events provided crucial eyewitness testimony for the eventual prosecution. Mr. Hayes arrived at sunset and appeared to be enjoying an elaborate dinner that Mrs. Crane had prepared. "I could see them through the windows, engaged in animated conversation over what appeared to be multiple courses of food and wine." The detective watched in horror as Isabel's dinner party took its deadly turn. "At approximately 10 o'clock, I observed Mrs. Crane serve what appeared to be coffee or tea to her guest. Within minutes of consuming the beverage, Mr. Hayes slumped forward in his chair, clearly unconscious or dead. Mrs. Crane showed no distress at this development and immediately began methodical preparations that suggested she had performed this routine many times before. Morrison's testimony revealed the cold efficiency with which Isabel disposed of her victims. She stripped the body of all clothing and personal effects, wrapped it in heavy canvas, and dragged it outside to the large oven structure behind her house. Her movements were practiced and efficient, showing no hesitation or emotional distress. The detective maintained his surveillance throughout the night, documenting every aspect of Isabel's disposal process. She maintained the fire in that oven throughout the night, periodically adding fuel and tending the flames. By morning, there was no trace of the man who had entered her house the previous evening. No remains, no evidence, nothing but ashes that she scattered to the desert wind. Morrison's investigation also revealed how Isabel disposed of victims' belongings and horses. The following day, she loaded Hayes's possessions onto a pack animal and rode into the desert. She returned several hours later with the animal unloaded. having disposed of the evidence in some remote location that only she knew about. Armed with eyewitness testimony and mounting circumstantial evidence, Morrison contacted Cochise County Sheriff Daniel Coleman and requested immediate action against Isabel Crane. The sheriff initially expressed skepticism about the accusations. The idea of a refined lady conducting systematic murder seemed almost impossible to believe, but Morrison's evidence was compelling, and the pattern of disappearances was undeniable. Sheriff Coleman organized a raid on Isabel's ranch, hoping to capture her before she could destroy additional evidence or claim another victim. When the sheriff's posse arrived at Devil's Canyon with arrest warrants, they found a woman who seemed genuinely bewildered by the accusations against her. Isabel's performance during the initial confrontation was masterful, displaying exactly the right mixture of confusion, indignation, and feminine vulnerability that would be expected from an innocent woman falsely accused of terrible crimes. Mrs. Crane's reaction to our accusations appeared completely genuine, Sheriff Coleman later reported. She denied any knowledge of missing men beyond the brief social encounters she acknowledged having in town. Her explanation for each disappearance was reasonable and supported by what appeared to be authentic documentation. The search of Isabel's property initially turned up little obvious evidence of criminal activity. The house was immaculate, with no visible bloodstains or signs of violence. The outdoor oven showed no evidence of recent use, and even the most thorough examination failed to reveal obvious traces of the crimes Morrison claimed to have witnessed. But Isabel had made one crucial error that would ultimately lead to her conviction. Hidden in a carefully concealed compartment beneath the floorboards of her bedroom, investigators discovered a collection of personal items that had belonged to her victims: pocket watches, jewelry, important papers, and most damning of all, detailed notes about each man's background, finances, and personal circumstances. The discovery of this evidence cache transformed the case from one based primarily on witness testimony to one supported by physical proof of systematic criminal activity. Each item in the collection could be connected to a specific missing person, and the detailed notes revealed the calculating way Isabel had selected and studied her victims. Dr. Marcus Webb, who had narrowly escaped becoming one of Isabel's victims, was called upon to examine the physical evidence and provide expert testimony about the likely methods used to kill the victims. His medical analysis revealed the sophisticated nature of Isabel's murder techniques. Based on Detective Morrison's eyewitness account of rapid unconsciousness followed by apparent death, and considering the substances available to someone with access to medical supplies, I believe Mrs. Crane employed poison as her primary method of execution, Dr. Webb testified. The physician's analysis revealed how Isabel had acquired the knowledge and materials necessary for systematic poisoning. Among the items discovered in her possession were several vials containing substances that, while having legitimate medical uses, could prove fatal if administered in sufficient quantities. The presence of these materials, combined with medical texts found in her library, suggests extensive study of toxicology and pharmacology. Dr. Webb's testimony also explained the complete absence of physical remains from Isabel's victims. The prolonged high-temperature incineration witnessed by Detective Morrison, combined with the arid desert climate and active scavenging by coyotes and other carrion feeders, would be sufficient to eliminate virtually all traces of human remains. Mrs. Crane had developed methods that were nearly perfect for concealing evidence of her crimes. The trial of Isabel Crane became the most sensational criminal case in Arizona Territory history. The courthouse in Tombstone was packed daily with spectators who had traveled from throughout the region to catch a glimpse of the woman who had terrorized the frontier with her deadly hospitality. The prosecution, led by Territorial Attorney General William Hayes, built their case methodically around three pillars of evidence: Detective Morrison's eyewitness testimony, the systematic pattern of disappearances, and the physical evidence found in Isabel's hidden cache. The defendant stands accused of 9 counts of first-degree murder, each carried out with premeditation and careful planning, Hayes told the jury in his opening statement. The evidence will show that Mrs. Crane systematically identified, lured, and murdered traveling men, whose disappearance was unlikely to prompt immediate investigation. Isabel's defense attorney, Thomas Morgan, faced the difficult task of defending a client against overwhelming evidence. His strategy focused on attacking the credibility of the prosecution's witnesses and arguing that the evidence was purely circumstantial. The prosecution asks you to believe that this refined lady, a woman of obvious education and breeding, committed acts of such barbarity that they challenge belief, Morgan argued. They offer you the testimony of a Mexican ranch hand whose story changes with each telling, a private detective whose reputation depends on solving this case, and a collection of common household items that could belong to anyone. But the prosecution's case proved overwhelming. Detective Morrison's detailed testimony about witnessing Isabel poison and incinerate Robert Hayes was corroborated by Carlos Valdez's months of surveillance observations. The pattern of disappearances was too systematic to be explained by coincidence, and the physical evidence found in Isabel's possession directly linked her to multiple victims. The most damning evidence came from handwriting analysis of the forged notes that had been used to explain each victim's disappearance. Expert testimony established that all the notes had been written by the same person, and comparison with Isabel's known handwriting confirmed that she was the forger. When called to testify in her own defense, Isabel maintained her performance of innocent bewilderment. She denied all accusations and claimed that any evidence found in her possession had been planted by enemies seeking to destroy her reputation. "I am a simple widow trying to make a life for herself in this harsh territory," she testified. "I have shown nothing but kindness and hospitality to travelers who needed assistance, and now I am being punished for my Christian charity by people who cannot understand how a woman might live independently." But the jury saw through her facade, recognizing the calculating intelligence behind her performance of feminine helplessness. After deliberating for less than 3 hours, they returned verdicts of guilty on all 9 counts of first-degree murder. Judge William Henderson, who presided over the trial, noted the unprecedented nature of the case in his sentencing remarks. "In 25 years of frontier jurisprudence, I have never encountered criminal behavior that combined such systematic planning with such complete disregard for human life. The defendant's crimes represent a level of calculated evil that challenges our understanding of human nature." The judge's sentence reflected both the severity of Isabel's crimes and the need to demonstrate that territorial justice applied equally to all criminals, regardless of gender or social standing. "Isabel Crane, you have been found guilty of 9 counts of first-degree murder. This court sentences you to be hanged by the neck until dead, and may God have mercy on your soul." Isabel Crane was executed at sunrise on January 15, 1880, becoming one of the few women to face capital punishment in Arizona Territory. She maintained her innocence to the end, refusing to provide any information about additional victims or the methods she had used to dispose of evidence so completely. The execution drew hundreds of spectators from throughout the territory, many traveling considerable distances to witness the end of Arizona's most feared serial killer. Local newspapers provided extensive coverage, with headlines reflecting the public's fascination with a case that had challenged traditional assumptions about criminal behavior and gender roles. Even after Isabel's execution, mysteries surrounding her crimes remained unsolved. Despite extensive searches of the desert around her former ranch, investigators never recovered physical remains of her victims or the locations where she had hidden their belongings and equipment. Modern forensic techniques have enabled contemporary investigators to re-examine the case with tools unavailable to territorial authorities. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of the former ranch property have revealed several anomalous areas that might contain buried evidence, but excavation efforts have been limited by the remote location and harsh desert conditions. Psychological profiles developed by modern criminal experts suggest that Isabel suffered from severe antisocial personality disorder combined with psychopathic traits that enabled her to commit systematic murder without emotional distress. Her ability to maintain a facade of normalcy while conducting regular killings demonstrates sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques. The case continues to fascinate researchers studying the development of criminal investigation methods and the psychology of serial murder. Detective Morrison's systematic approach to gathering evidence represents early application of modern investigative techniques, while Isabel's methods demonstrate how criminals adapt their behavior to exploit social vulnerabilities and institutional limitations. For the residents of Arizona Territory, Isabel's crimes had lasting impact on social attitudes toward strangers and isolated living arrangements. The knowledge that a seemingly respectable woman could be responsible for systematic murder challenged traditional gender role expectations and created new awareness of potential dangers in frontier hospitality customs. Contemporary law enforcement agencies study the case as an historical example of how serial killers exploit social conventions and institutional weaknesses to avoid detection while conducting systematic crimes. Isabel's methods for victim selection and evidence disposal continue to inform modern understanding of criminal behavior patterns. The site of Isabel's former ranch remains largely unchanged, though the original buildings were destroyed by weather and time decades ago. Occasional visitors report feeling uneasy when exploring the area, though these sensations are more likely attributable to knowledge of the location's history than to supernatural influences. For modern travelers crossing the American Southwest, the story of Isabel Crane serves as reminder that the greatest dangers on the frontier often came from sources that appeared most trustworthy. Her exploitation of loneliness and hospitality as weapons demonstrates how predators can manipulate our most basic human needs for companionship and social connection. The empty desert where Isabel once conducted her deadly business continues to whisper warnings about the dangers of trusting too quickly and accepting invitations that seem too perfect to be genuine. In the harsh landscape of the frontier, survival often depended on recognizing that the most beautiful smile might hide the cruelest intentions, and the warmest welcome might actually be an invitation to death.